The most defining attribute of an indie game is its ability to be unique. The entire genre is one big ever-flowing passion river. Every time you step into it, a different experience is delivered. The range of quality varies like the velocity of a roller coaster. The peaks can be so tall and exhilarating, yet the lowest points are dreadfully slow. For roller coasters, this acts as tense build-up, whereas indie games at this minimum point are miserable to play. But for both cases in this analogy, this minimum is what will put most people off the whole experience. Every big bunch will have its share of bad apples, and I believe that the good apples in the indie game fruit basket have so much to offer that you'd be missing out if you didn't at least have a look. Whether or not you're convinced, or if you agree or disagree with what I have said thus far, I want to present what I believe to be one of the greatest strengths that indie games have, and I want to talk about the best example of this strength that I have experienced to date: the importance of indie game uniqueness and the game Rainworld. Rainworld is unique. At its simplest, you could categorize it as a 2D platformer. If you are feeling a bit bolder, you might even be brave enough to describe it as a physics-based 2D platformer about exploring ruins and overcoming the adversities found within a dead alien world. But if you're me, and you've experienced Rainworld before, you could also describe it as a game about an ecosystem. The decayed and abandoned world you explore throughout the game's length is beautifully visualized. Creatures that inhabit it, similarly mysterious and uniquely dangerous. The physics-based movement, whilst initially feeling heavy and unruly, becomes an essential tool for the player, with many intricacies to pave the way to mastery. And yet to me, I always think about Rainworld as a game about an ecosystem. In this section, I want to go into why that is, why my mind lingers on a single fragment of the vibrant mosaic that is Rainworld, and why that fragment elevates it to a significant degree. But before I do so, I want to preface this video with a few points. Undertale, Outer Wilds, not to be confused with Outer Worlds, One Shot, and Inscription are all games that will almost certainly be the most impactful they can be when the player first experiences them, even more so for these games than for others. I attribute this to the narrative, exploration, and gameplay components of these games being built on surprises and having intent to defy expectations. You can go into these games completely blind and leave wishing you were as blind as you were before you began, just to experience it all one more time. I blew my chance at a true first experience of Outer Wilds. I experienced it secondhand. However, even as I watched Joseph Anderson finish that game live, I still held that yearnful feeling of wanting to go back and experience it all again. I watched a full hour of Undertale before going in and playing it to completion myself. However, I didn't blow my shot, both with One Shot and Inscription. Playing those games firsthand made me realize how much value that exists in doing so. You progress at your own pace, connect the dots yourself, and come to your own conclusions. Rainworld is no exception to this, though it is to a lesser extent, which I'll talk more on later. My second point is that Rainworld is a brutal game. To convince you of this, I want to bring up two things. Firstly, the game is listed in the credits of Getting Over It with Bennett Foddy as games you might also enjoy. For those not in the know, Getting Over It is a game that consists of climbing an enormous mountain with nothing but a hammer and a pot, as quoted from the game's Steam store page. that was stated as being made for a certain kind of person with the express purpose of hurting them. It's a game built on the premise of frustration, made to push the player to the edge of their own limit of that emotion, that bitter frustration. Rainworld being listed in the credits of such a game should suffice as a warning, but the second thing I want to give you is a primary source, originating from myself. A brief retelling of my initial 2 attempted tries at completing the game. During my first playthrough, I stumbled my way into an area that I did not know how to progress through. I was getting slightly frustrated as I knew there must have been a way through, locked behind a pathway I had missed or a mechanic I didn't know about. I didn't want to continue what felt like blindly running into the same wall over and over again, and instead opted to reset from the beginning with the wisdom learned and knowledge gained from the first attempt, which, while admittedly brief, showed me the bare basics of what to expect from the game. My second attempt progressed much quicker than the previous. I more confidently moved through the environment with a more developed understanding of my movement options. I responded to threats I had previously encountered with a greater understanding of how to do so, and in general I felt more in control of my character. Everything was becoming more tense and engaging. I took more risks, explored more at a greater pace, and because of that I was able to progress beyond my prior attempt in a fraction of the time. I continued from this point until I reached the end, being struck with awe and amazement of each new environment and mechanic that I would discover, is what I would say if I was a pathological liar. Even with the knowledge gained and wisdom learned from an entire previous attempt, this second try ended with a striking similarity to that of the story of Icarus. I boldly rushed into a new area, intoxicated by the sights and emboldened by newfound confidence. I refused to retreat from a location that was clearly reaching beyond my own limitations at that moment. Higher and higher I went, until I flew too close to the sun, which in this case is soft-locking myself, being caught in an endless death loop with no method of escape. I hope this shows how downright cruel this game can be at times. It's a game about learning, not through tutorials or expository cutscenes, but by grueling trial and error. You die over and over again until you don't, learning what works from the success and what doesn't from each failure. Maybe I'm rushing and being too careless, or maybe I just had an unlucky run. Maybe I should tackle threats head on, or maybe I should try avoiding threats more often than I face them. It can start to feel like a visually complicated binary search algorithm, going between each extreme in playstyle, trying to find the one that works best amongst so many varied approaches. The answer will vary for each player, but that solution will be preceded by numerous deaths, raw and harsh trial and error. This game is brutal, and I think you're best knowing that before going in. Before I continue to talk on and analyse the unique aspects of Rainworld, I want to give you my third and final point of this section. Difficulty in games like Rainworld is easy to reduce in increments so long as you're willing to ditch the self-imposed challenge of a pure blind playthrough with no external help. This topic could justify a video in and of itself, however, to keep it short and sweet, if you head into Rainworld and find yourself feeling aimless or not enjoying the blind exploration, then don't think of your experience as lesser if you turn to external help and use a map, for example, especially if it's between doing that and risking dropping the game entirely. Although going beyond that and browsing, for example, a creature's Wikipedia page, I would advise caution. There's a certain line that separates assisting and damaging the game experience when seeking external help. Where this line is varies based on the game itself. For a game like Outer Wilds, it's easier to ruin the wonder of later sections by trying to seek external help early on, and whilst it might be harder to do so in Rainworld, the line still does exist, and I would argue that by going past just using a map, you risk crossing that line. But again, if it's between playing the game and not, then it should go without saying that it's up to you to decide if you need to do so. We're now at the conclusion of my final point for this section, and now would be a good time to give a sort of soft spoiler warning. For me to confidently demonstrate how unique this game is, I would have to talk about mechanics, creatures, and locations that you may want to discover for yourself. Important narrative moments will also be discussed in a later section, though I'll give an additional warning before that. So, if you have any interest in playing Rainworld at all, then now would be a good time to go and do so. For those saying, I'll continue from where I left off. didn't touch Rainworld again for a couple months after my second attempt. This wasn't due to frustration, but instead a much more mundane reason: preoccupation with my education. Eventually, when some free time came my way, I launched Rainworld again for my third attempt with two rules in mind. The first was simple: no more resets. This run would be seen through until its finality. I wanted to see all that this game could offer in a single unbroken run. This presented issues, however. The possibility of being softlocked again was a concern, and although I enjoyed the blind exploration in my first run, I began feeling aimless throughout the second. There are locations you must venture to for the ending to be within reach, and whilst you do have a guide that pushes you to discovering those regions, I didn't fully understand it. As I mentioned earlier, I got stuck on my first attempt. I simply couldn't find a pathway to progress through the region I was in. It's appropriate to add now that this is when I tried to strictly follow that guide. On my second attempt, I prioritized exploring new areas over following the guide. I found doing so more fun, and yet I softlocked myself, having no idea of how close I was to reaching the guide's destination. It all led to me wanting something more concrete, a way to progress without relying on the guide, and this is where my second rule came in. Before beginning the run, I opened a map, looked at the region names, and found the one that stuck out to me the most, known as the Wall. This would be my destination. I then webbed together a pathway of regions previously unexplored that would take me there, and thus I had a route. I took note of this, closed the map, and swore not to open it again unless I was completely stuck in a similar vein to my first attempt. Thankfully, throughout the run, I never needed to do so. With a personal destination to progress towards and with solutions to potential issues in place, my third attempt began. This is where I felt I had truly experienced Rainworld. I want to pull back to the primary topic of this video, and this third attempt is a good basis for doing so. With that said, I want to give my answer to the following question: how is Rainworld unique, and what does this add to the experience? Rainworld is a weird world. The decaying remains of an alien civilization seemingly long gone is an odd yet strangely appealing setting, at least for me. This world is not built for you, and whilst evolution builds a planet's inhabitants to fit in and survive the world itself, it becomes much more complicated when the world was once conquered by an intelligent species. This species was vast, positively alien, and much more technologically advanced in comparison to what we as humans have achieved. The markings left upon the world in their wake still stand, being in the form of industrial sectors, drainage systems, and monolithic constructs, though a considerable amount of it has since been reduced to ruin. They have seemingly irreversibly damaged this world, leaving a scar upon it in the form of an artificial disaster. Torrential downpours, ones capable of flooding the ruins of the world and crushing its wildlife. These downpours have forced the ecosystem within the world to adapt, with creatures using hyperphagia in the brief time between each downpour and hibernation within the various shelters scattered throughout the world to avoid being crushed or drowned under rainfall. You play as one of these creatures, and unsurprisingly, this cycle of foraging and hunting for food, followed by seeking shelter to safely hibernate, is the core gameplay loop of Rainworld. The creature you inhabit species is one of dozens within this ecosystem. It is an omnivore, both predator and prey, but mostly prey. It has survived in this ruined world for existing in these cycles, being both agile enough to traverse the world with speed and intelligent enough to utilize tools such as spears and rocks as weapons. Slugcat is the name of this species. Their appearance should make the name self-explanatory. With the Downpour DLC, Rainworld contains 8, technically 9 different Slugcats to play as, each with their own story and twist on gameplay. However, to narrow the scope of this video, I'll be focusing on the Survivor. Going in as the player, you have limited knowledge of this world, of its creatures and its hazards, but the same is true for the creature you play as. The Survivor is a juvenile. Having begun its story being separated from its family, both the player and it must study and adapt to this bizarre ecosystem they are now a part of together in order to reunite the Survivor to its family. The tutorial works to keep the player in line with the Slugcat. You're given the basics in movement, in survival, and in navigation. Everything else must be learned through experience. This decision, in a game design perspective, is very interesting to me. I have a memory of watching the developers speak to an audience in something similar to a TED Talk about the philosophy behind Rainworld. Looking back on that memory, I couldn't find the video in discussion, so this next part may be a complete fabrication. At a certain segment of this video, one of the developers mentioned that the other originally wanted for there to be no tutorial, or at least a much more minimalistic tutorial, although for accessibility reasons they opted to have the tutorial that we can see today. It shines a light into the philosophy and mindset of the developers as to what they envisioned as being a true first experience of Rainworld for a new player. The user interface in the game is minimal yet contains crucial information, yet even elements of it are never explained to the player in the current version of the game, and yet originally the developers wanted even less. No explanation for the cycles, no explanation for shelters, no explanation for even needing a certain amount of food to rest within shelters. Everything would be confusing and overwhelming for a new player going in blind, and I could only imagine how many would quit the game permanently after dying for the 15th or 20th time, not understanding how they can avoid the fatal downpours, what causes them, or even where they're supposed to go. It all comes down to developer intention. When introducing Rainworld to a GDC panel in 2017, James Primate, a lead developer, had this to say on the gameplay of Rainworld. Quote, "The gameplay is learning to navigate through Rainworld's ecosystem, how the creatures of the world interact, what they want, etc., and sort of finding your way through as a sort of underpowered little creature." End quote. From this quote, it's clear that the developers wanted Rainworld to revolve around learning, and for an entire game to build itself off of such a concept, it must be vague, complex, and unique. Predictability would be the nemesis to such a game. It's also evident that they wanted the game to embody a struggle, with them mentioning the player inhabiting an underpowered little creature. To get a bit artsy, I'm confident the developers wanted the game to embody that struggle that exists in real-life ecosystems that we can observe today. The image of predator chasing prey, the idea of kill or be killed, concept of struggling to stay alive by any means necessary. It's a bold direction to take a game, no less an indie game, but in the words of James Primate, quote, "When we were developing Rainworld, everybody told us that it was too hard, too confusing, too long. They said people wouldn't get it, that we were self-indulgent. But we knew that if we resonated with these themes, it meant that someone else would too. Don't compromise your art, they don't know." End quote. They knew that Rainworld wouldn't stick with a number of people, they simply wouldn't get it. Rainworld is purely a product of that vision and of the themes that James Primate mentioned. It provides an experience that is truly unique because of that, even at the cost of a broader appeal. As someone who resonated with those themes, I find their passion to be very inspiring, and I'm glad they took the leap and necessary risk to fully materialize that vision. In the GDC panel previously mentioned, intended gameplay and user experience wasn't the first aspect of the game that James Primate talked about. He brought up the hallmark feature of Rainworld when initially describing the game. Quote, "You're kind of existing in this large open world ecosystem of AI creatures." End quote. Note how this is worded. You aren't alienated from this ecosystem, you aren't trying to escape or fight it either, you're directly a part of it, existing within it. Also notice how he directly ties the world into the ecosystem instead of separating them. It's emphasized as an open world ecosystem and not an ecosystem within an open world. There's a key difference between these two distinctions. The ecosystem is a product of the world, and it's clear that thought and effort has been put into how to make that convincing to the player. A great example of this is the interactions between creatures and other creatures, and between creatures and the world itself. I'll start with how creatures interact with the world. Earlier, I spoke of how the slugcat species avoids the torrential downpours by hunting and hibernating in cycles. Well, these cycles aren't exclusive to the slugcat. The majority of creatures within the ecosystem must abide by the cycles for obvious reasons. The world is not exclusively hostile to the player, a theme which is necessary to create a convincing ecosystem. When the shadow of dark clouds begins to dim the world, most grounded creatures will scatter to find shelter. Even large predators will abandon chase with prey to do so. The rain is an absolute force, and whilst it's possible to escape the jaws of numerous creatures, being caught out in a rainstorm is guaranteed death for most. However, there are creatures capable of flight. The prime example being these large, mask-wearing biomechanical vultures. Their arrival is always marked by a change of music and a large, descending shadow being visible in the background of most screens. In hindsight, this may seem a bit obvious, but it was a really fun revelation realizing that they seek shelter by flying above the clouds, nesting in the spires of towering superstructures, in an area that the player themselves can eventually ascend to, with gorgeous visuals accompanying the dizzying heights and unfamiliar newfound calmness. Another noteworthy aspect of the open world ecosystem is how certain creatures have evolved or adapted to the environment they inhabit, with two examples being the carnivorous pole plant that mimics itself as one of the many poles that are used for traversal, both by the player's slugcat and by other creatures, and the earwig-like insect known as a dropwig. These insects will perch themselves under ceilings or overhangs using hanging debris or foliage to blend in, a process you can actually see them doing if you catch them early enough into a cycle. It will drop down and ambush any creature caught passing underneath, which gives the drop part in Dropwig. Both creatures act as great surprises when first encountering them. Both have great tells and counters, and both serve to incentivize caution when travelling through regions, in my case leading to many double surprises when re-encountering them, remembering that I should have remembered why I should check poles before climbing on them, or why I should scan the ceilings of an area before running through it. They fit with the world in a way which feels natural, which really helps to sell that illusion that there is glue that melds the world and the ecosystem together, forming that open world ecosystem that James Primate spoke of. The inhabitants of Rainworld are at the game's core. This is made clear by the nature of wanting a game about an ecosystem, but for this to be convincing to the player, thought must be put into the design of these creatures, the areas where they are found, the interactions they have with the world itself, which I talked about previously, but also their interactions with other creatures. I'll talk about that in this segment. However, I also think it's important to zoom out and think of this topic from the perspective of Rainworld being a game. Doing so opens up many more questions and shows just how daunting of a task making a game about a fictional ecosystem is. Creatures now have to serve a certain gameplay purpose. How will it be fun and or interesting for the player to encounter them? How will it convey its unique mechanic to the player without feeling overly gamey or unnatural? How will it visually or auditorially portray its intentions to the player? The procedurally generated animation within the game makes that last question extra challenging. Every creature can make any range of motions in an attempt to do even basic actions. It muddies the clarity when trying to display visual intent, though this actually ends up benefiting the game. There's a specific creature that is honestly the highlight of Rainworld for me, and deciphering the intentions of that creature is a minigame in and of itself. I'll talk more on them soon, but for now I'll get back on point. Creature on creature interactions. I'll start with the continuation of a quote by James Primate that I left unfinished earlier. Quote, "For all the AI creatures, the intentions for us, the developers, is so they have as much agency as the player character. They're moving around the world independently, they're hunting, they're searching for food, they're afraid of things." End quote. When you wake up from hibernation, so do other creatures. Some will roam around their territory, spending the cycle warding off others of their species contesting that territory and eating any prey that enters it. Some will travel to ambush positions and wait for prey to stumble upon them. Some will travel in hunting packs. Others will watch from above, scanning the environment below for anything that moves. Most predators will be prey to others, and even those that can be considered apex predators will infight amongst themselves under the right conditions. There's a great feeling of the world being alive and active, even though it's decayed and desolate. That contrast gives a sense that there exists a hopeless persistence in these creatures, and that feeling makes Rainworld feel so unique. The obvious interaction between the dropwigs that I talked of earlier and other creatures is that they ambush and attempt to hunt most life that travels beneath them, but there's more interaction beyond that. Before finding a suitable perching spot, dropwigs are fairly docile. They ignore anything that they don't view as an immediate threat whilst they search. When perched, they might even bring bait and drop it underneath them to lure in creatures such as your slugcat. It's even possible to bait them into dropping prematurely by throwing grubs past their line of sight or avoiding their detection altogether by using the ink clouds formed by squid-like creatures known as hazers. Even when they drop, there's still more to them. Dropwigs are agile insects and are adept at climbing. They will pursue any prey if their initial ambush attempt was unsuccessful, but will give up and search for a new perching location if they are unable to catch their prey in a certain time frame. There's a great dynamic to this single creature, even when they're interacting with other dropwigs. A system exists where those with a low level of dominance will give up their perching spots to dropwigs with a higher level of dominance. Every individual creature is unique and will act and react differently to actions made by both the player and other creatures. However, going further into that gets a bit too technical and risks ruining the magic anyways. I'll pan away from the dropwig and focus on the most common creature found within Rainworld. From the relatively quiet outskirts to the verbally imposing gauntlet that is the wall, large, often cannibalistic predators, plainly known as lizards, will often block your path. Most lizards will spot other creatures using visual line of sight, however all will use sound to determine the potential location of another creature. Visually, this is represented by the head of the lizard lighting up and the emissions of particles around it. Lizards will appear in many variations, indicated by different colours, and as such are kept fresh gameplay wise. One variation will usually stick to a single area, protecting it as its territory. Another has the ability to climb along walls and use a long tongue to latch onto prey from a distance, and another variation may roam in packs, with the unique capability to communicate and coordinate chases for use of their antennae, which also acts to designate the alpha of the pack, who will tend to have the longest antenna of the group. Lizards in general will be afraid of creatures that are larger than them, for example the vultures that I mentioned earlier, or other creatures that pose a significant threat to them, such as the pole plant. All lizard subspecies will fight and contest other lizards for territory, with the sole exception being the yellow lizard, which is the variation with the antennae that I briefly mentioned earlier. This subspecies is also the most interesting when it comes to its interactions with the player and their slugcat, specifically during chases. Due to them holding territory and hunting in packs, they use their ability to communicate with each other telepathically to surround whatever they are hunting, with different yellow lizards approaching on the prey from different angles, making evading and escaping from an encounter with a pack of yellow lizards challenging if caught in a bad position. However, with the correct knowledge, it's possible to remove this ability from an entire pack. Each member in a pack is able to transmit information, but only to the pack's alpha, who acts as a sort of relay for the entire group. Killing the alpha will thus prevent the rest of the pack from coordinating when giving chase, robbing them of their most critical and lethal ability. It's a fun mechanic and gives an Achilles heel to a dangerous encounter for those who want to face it head on. If we go back to viewing lizards as a whole, there's another interesting mechanic involving interactions between them and the player's slugcat. If a player was to kill a creature considered as prey by a lizard, then locate a lizard and toss the corpse towards it, the lizard will recognize that the slugcat has fed them that corpse. For another example, if the player was to save a lizard after it has been grabbed by a vulture, the lizard will recognize that the slugcat has saved it. Creatures persist across cycles in Rainworld, and as such continuously feeding or helping the same lizard will build a positive relationship between it and the slugcat. This initially will make the lizard less aggressive towards you. It may drop chases sooner or prioritize chasing other creatures over your slugcat, but ultimately after feeding or saving it enough, it will become tamed. A tamed lizard will follow the slugcat around, going as far as to follow it into shelters and hibernate alongside it. They will act as bodyguards, defending the slugcat from threats, even those that it previously feared. Although for this relationship to continue, trust must be maintained. A poorly thrown rock can damage that trust, potentially resulting in the lizard snapping at the slugcat in confined spaces, whereas a poorly thrown spear could break that trust completely, reverting the reputation that was previously built up, though it can be regained. There's a fair amount of detail to this hidden mechanic, even though players are never really required or even really encouraged to engage with it, though it does help build up the world and make the intelligence of the creatures convincingly less artificial. To continue the focus on creature-on-creature interactions, I'll bring up the vultures that I mentioned prior. The vulture can be considered an apex predator. It has few natural predators and will hunt down most creatures. However, they are still mortal. It can be felled and repelled by a few other species, but thankfully your slugcat is one of them. Due to them being apex predators, their notable interactions are with other vultures. There's a culture that exists amongst them involving the odd signature masks that they adorn. Masked vultures will act independently of one another. They might target the same prey, but they won't fight each other over it. With a well-placed spear throw, the mask of one can be removed, and this changes their behaviour and how they are viewed by other masked vultures. Unmasking a vulture makes it personal. It now has beef with whoever unmasked it and will resolve the drama by hunting down and killing the infractor, even persisting between cycles in order to do so, which reminds me of one of my favourite characters from the canon Half-Life universe.
You fucked up my face.
However, that unmasked vulture is now seen as the bottom G by other masked vultures who are so disgusted by it that they will begin to attack and harass the unmasked if they are inside of it. This shows us that vultures regard their masks very highly. They might only be able to detect or recognize other vultures based on the mask itself. Speaking of the recognition, these masks taken from the vultures have uses for the player. After picking up a mask, the slugcat will place hold? What? The slugcat will hold the mask in front of its face, as though it is wearing a sort of tribal mask. When encountering a lizard with the mask in hand, it will recognize this mask as being that of a vulture's, which most subspecies of lizards will fear and as such will instinctually run away, although eventually they will see through this disguise. To put a capstone on this section focused on fauna, I want to tackle the most complex creature within this game. I've referred to it before as a highlight of Rainworld, and I want to emphasize how much I truly mean that. Learning the many possible interactions, the telegraphing for intentions, and the other various mechanics that make up this species was some of the most fun that I had within Rainworld. I'd even go as far as to say that this might be one of the most convincingly alive creatures that I have seen in any game, so much so that I think it deserves its own spoiler warning. You can go into Rainworld knowing about lizards, dropwigs, pole plants and vultures, understanding how they work and what they do. They'll lose the surprise that they would have, but you can still have fun simply interacting with them. You can have already seen gorgeous sights such as the wall, and whilst the surprising visuals might have already been seen, seeking it out for yourself will still be fun. However, because the blind experiences I had involving this creature were such a large part of Rainworld for me, I think you'd be missing out on such a significant part of the game by having it dissected before you go in, if you plan to do so of course. That's the end of the warning. If you're still content to continue, then I'll begin with a broad overview of the species in discussion. Scavengers act as a near equal to the player and their slugcat. They share the closest resemblance to slugcats than any other species in the game, both in terms of appearance and capabilities. They have enough intelligence to utilize spears and debris as weaponry, but are also capable of crafting bombs and explosive spears using volatile flora. They are mobile enough to access any location the slugcat is also able to access, with a humanoid figure and relatively short legs compared to longer arms that allow them to climb pipes and move swiftly in a quadrupedal fashion. In fact, on paper, a singular scavenger could even be superior to a slugcat. But to explain why, I first need to talk on the number of items the survivor can hold. The rules are simple. You have 2 hands and a stomach. Both hands are able to hold any item in the game, whether it be food, spears, or utilize items such as bombs or debris. However, the catch is that you cannot hold 2 spears at any given time, explosive or non-explosive. The stomach is a bit more restrictive. You are able to store 1 item into it that is currently in either hand that isn't a spear or food. However, to be able to access that item again, you must spend a brief moment to regurgitate it back out. When you do so, if a hand is currently empty, then the stored item will automatically be put into that hand, but if both hands are occupied, then that item will be spat onto the ground. The main restriction here is that the survivor can only ever hold onto a single spear at any given time. Going back to scavengers, this restriction does not apply to them. A scavenger will only ever occupy 1 hand with an item, but can store multiple spears on their back. This makes engagements with scavengers dangerous, especially when factoring in that they rarely hunt alone. Whilst fighting with scavengers can be fun due to how challenging it is to do so, focusing solely on that is like eating the icing of a cake separately from the sponge. The scavengers have developed their own cultures and traditions around various objects within the world, and unlike the more nomadic slugcats, who will often travel around solo or in small groups consisting of family members, scavengers will gather in tribes and form roots in a single region. There are different tribes scattered throughout the different playable regions of Rainworld. They send hunting parties out to roam that region, and these groups are likely how the player will first encounter a scavenger. Initially, they all view the survivor with caution. They won't attempt to hunt it, but understand that it is a potential threat to them, seeing that it is capable of using spears and debris as weaponry. The body language of a scavenger is the best indication of their intent towards you. A surprised scavenger's eyes will widen and faint spines will stand up on their back. A scavenger that sees you as a threat will point at you, possibly with a spear, to indicate to the accompanying party that you are a threat, whereas more aggressive or active scavengers in that group might raise a spear in your direction or throw one next to you, giving you a clear warning. It might not come across by simply stating it, but trying to decipher this body language as it occurred was genuinely tense, and though I still don't know if doing so mattered at all, I would always drop any spears I had on me and would go prone if a scavenger ever raised a spear at me in a desperate attempt to make them see me as less of a threat. A key area where players must engage with scavengers is when trying to pass through their tolls, and this is a great opportunity to talk on the culture that scavengers have developed and how it is conveyed to the player through the environment. Initially stumbling upon one of these tolls can be quite daunting. Numerous scavengers will guard the designated area, which will be identifiable by a large impaled skull, often painted red and decorated with tiny white pearls. These pearls hold significant value in scavenger culture, as can be seen with them being used for ornate decorations and being stashed in highly guarded scavenger treasuries. As a side note, there's actually a pretty cute interaction that occurs with scavengers when the slugcat is holding a pearl in either hand. The scavenger will signify that it wants the pearl by briefly reaching a hand towards the slugcat, followed by it scratching the ground. Back on topic though, If the player does drop a pearl near a scavenger, it will be seen as an act of trading with that scavenger that grabs it, as said scavenger will drop whatever item it is currently holding to grab the pearl and leave to stash it away, leaving the slugcat free to take whatever they dropped. Pearls are so valuable to this species that they'll drop bombs or even explosive spears just to get a hold of them. There's more to this act of trading pearls, however going back to the scavenger tolls, the slugcat will be halted on the side they enter from, conveyed by one of the guards continuously hitting the ground with the butt of their spear. Trying to pass through the toll at this point will result in the guards becoming aggressive and that tribe of scavengers thinking less of you in general. The way to pass through the toll safely and respectfully is to give the scavengers guarding it an item of a certain value or a combination of items that will match that value. Doing so using a pearl will result in a guard dropping what they have to pick the pearl up and another guard walking up to you to wave you through the toll. I partially feel lucky that I made the connections needed to understand this system fairly early, with the initial spear tapping and numerous scavengers warning me that I couldn't simply run through the room, and thinking to experiment with giving them a pearl based on the skull in the room being lined with a number of them. It's these connections and thus this system that gave me an immediate appreciation for the scavengers and the clear work that must have gone into making it even possible to understand them based purely on the surrounding environment and visual gestures. Now would be a good time to bring back the point that I briefly mentioned earlier. Passing through a toll without payment results in scavengers thinking lesser of the slugcat, however this extends and expands into a reputation system, divided into global reputation and regional reputation. Harming or killing a scavenger when witnesses are in sight, speeding through tolls without paying, or stealing from scavengers repeatedly will damage the general reputation with scavengers in that region. These scavengers will become more defensive and hostile towards the slugcat. What were previously warning spear throws might become more precise. A raised spear will be thrown at you more often rather than being held to warn you. If reputation continues to lower, scavengers will become less defensive and take a more active approach, sending out death squads to hunt and kill your slugcat. Furthermore, scavengers will travel and trade between different tribes, and word will spread of your actions. This means that if you were to kill multiple scavengers in a single region, the global community of scavengers will hear of this, and when you inevitably travel to the next region over, the scavengers there will open with hostility towards you rather than playing it cautious. It's yet another reason why learning to understand the interactions between yourself and the scavengers is vital to your experience in Rainworld. The journey becomes tremendously more difficult if you choose the warpath, especially with how prolific scavengers are throughout the various regions. But what's the alternative? A warpath implies the existence of a peace path. And this does exist, but now the question lies on how full peace is achieved. How can we purposefully increase their reputation, as simply remaining neutral and avoiding interactions will keep the scavengers in a perpetual state of cautiousness? Well, I've already mentioned the main ways to do so in passing. Passing through tools respectfully and showing them that you're open to trading amongst them through semi-frequent trading. Building and maintaining a positive relationship with scavengers is beneficial to the player as well as being noticeable. With just a few trades and or paid toll passages, most scavengers will be less on guard when encountering the slugcat. Few will see it as a threat, and even fewer if any will attempt to ward it off with a warning spear. Continuing to improve the relationship beyond this will lead to some scavengers actively trying to save the slugcat from danger. And at a certain threshold, tolls can be crossed freely at a slight cost to reputation and eventually even no reputational cost whatsoever. Scavengers will also happily allow you to access any stashed goods held within their treasuries if they think highly of you, allowing you to stock up on some of the most potent weapons or items available whenever you pass through areas nearby to these stockpiles. These points make keeping a positive reputation with scavengers extremely appealing. They go from being the most dangerous threat found within the game to being the best ally you're capable of obtaining in such a harsh world. Regarding the behavioural changes being noticeable, I honestly think an intuitive player will notice the reactional and attitudinal changes that scavengers will have based on their own actions towards them, and from that will deduce that a reputation system exists. However, in my initial playthroughs, I didn't make that deduction until I saw a certain passage gain or lose progress based on my actions towards scavengers in that cycle. So what are passages? To describe them briefly, a passage is a vague milestone or achievement that can be obtained by the player by doing various actions over the course of multiple cycles. To understand how to obtain a passage will require use of its displayed name as a sort of hint, and experimentation to figure out what actions might gain or lose its progress, the result of which being displayed at the end of every cycle. There is an incentive to obtain passages beyond raw completionism, as for each one completed, the player is rewarded with a one-time use ability to fast travel to a shelter of any region that they have previously hibernated in, making them achievements worth obtaining. Tying this back with scavengers, a passage exists called the Chieftain, and during my playthroughs I would notice that it would only change in cycles where interactions with scavengers would occur. Any transgressions against them would result in the passage regressing, whereas saving a scavenger from danger or simply trading with one would result in the passage progressing. It was that passage that made it click for me that a scavenger reputation system was almost certain to exist within the game, and that click made me more careful and deliberate with my interactions involving them. I've talked extensively on scavengers at this point, and whilst I think I have a good grasp on the mechanics surrounding them, I wouldn't be surprised at all if there was still more that I am unaware of. These creatures really did elevate Rainworld for me by a significant degree, and I can only hope that I was able to convey why that is semi-decently through what I have said thus far. They are tied into the world at an environmental level, and combined with the mechanical complexity that surrounds them and the visual depth embedded in the various gestures and expressions they are capable of conveying, they quickly became one of the most convincingly sentient and conscious NPCs that I have seen in a game. Earlier in this video, I mentioned how predictability would be the nemesis to games such as Rainworld. Well, I would like to reignite that point and discuss how Rainworld avoids being predictable. I have already previously mentioned the procedural animation that the game uses for all of its creatures, and I believe that this is an important aspect of how the game is visually unpredictable. Movement in general is more naturally fluid due to its inclusion as opposed to the more standard preset animations that ultimately become predictable for repeated use. However, moving beyond visuals and the question is a bit trickier, and requires more in-depth analysis to properly answer. The question we arrive at is, how is the game unpredictable in its gameplay? We can go further and simplify the question in the context of Rainworld. How does each cycle differ from the last? To answer that in full, I need to provide context that requires me to spoil several story moments and one major plot point that impacts on gameplay and how it is perceived. If you don't want to receive major story spoilers, then you may want to skip this section. The reveal is that nothing truly dies in this world. A curse of perpetual death and reincarnation has plagued every living creature that has wandered this planet, including the ancient civilization that ruled it long ago. This same race sought to free themselves of this cycle of life and death, this so-called Great Problem, though it is clear to the creatures inhabiting the world long after their mysterious disappearance that a solution was never found in their lifetime. In their wake lies failed constructs made in desperation with the sole purpose of assisting to find a solution. These constructs tower over the land below, their superstructures, made to facilitate an artificial intelligence, being sustained purely off of large volumes of water, and thus being the reason behind the torrential downpours. The water they intake is utilized, presumably converted to vapor, and is then ejected outwards, creating the monstrous rain clouds that render the land below the clouds uninhabitable. The ancient precursors had prepared for this, having built cities on top of their constructs, the top of which easily reaching high above the clouds, though it does show the pure desperation they felt towards solving the problem they faced. They willingly abandoned their lives on the surface, factories, farms, subways. They left a cultural citadel permanently cast in the shadow of the machine that would cause its ruination, all to create numerous artificial intelligences that they could only hope would assist in the process of finding a cure for their curse. These constructs are known as iterators, and are still active in the time period we and the survivor experience, though some are more so than others. For an unknowable amount of time, they have been continuously trying to find a way to solve the great problem of their creators, who have long since vanished or found a way to ascend past their curse of reincarnation on their own. Either way, their absences left the iterators purposeless, solving a problem that no longer needs to be solved. On your journey, you can interact with two of these iterators. The first can be discovered by following the guide that I mentioned earlier, which in actuality is an observer acting as an independent external eye for its iterator. These observers can be seen elsewhere, appearing in various colours depending on the iterator they are linked to, and are capable of projecting various symbols and imagery, which the yellow observer acting as the guide for the survivor will use to indicate the direction of approaching dangers, potential food sources, shelters, and the pathway leading to the iterator it is acting on the behalf of. Following this path will have you inevitably reach the shoreline, a bleak region consisting of large open bodies of water, separated by islands connected through tunnels and flooded pipelines. Traversing through this area is tricky, especially considering the dangers that lurk below the tide. Irregardless, the eastmost point of this region is the destination the guide has been leading you to throughout the game. A half-submerged alien structure, a decayed and continuously deteriorating iterator known as Lux to the Moon. As a side note on the naming conventions the precursors used, many of them are similarly bizarre, with the most pronounced example being the name and presumably title of 8 Sons, Countless Leaves, of the House of 6 Wagons, Count of No Living Blocks, Counsellor of 2, Duke of 1, Humble Secretary of the Congregation of Never Dwindling Righteousness. It's a comedically and practically long name and title that strikes out as being absolutely alien, although why wouldn't this be the case? It's a very interesting detail and helps in making an alien world and species convincing, as it would make little sense for them to share the exact same or even really similar naming conventions with us humans. Anyways, as this isn't a story overview, I won't speak on what lies inside of the submerged superstructure. However, I will say that the state it is currently in has been directly caused by another of its kind, one that has been driven mad by its own frustration and its inability to ascend or die like its creators once must have done. So, the big revelation is that nothing truly dies. This helps to explain why our slugcat is able to reincarnate after being killed during a cycle. It also helps to address why creatures will be restocked in a region if they are killed. They do in fact die, but will reincarnate back to their den, similar to our slugcat after a varying amount of time. This is represented by there being a set percentage chance for them to respawn at the start of every new cycle following their death. As such, you might kill a lizard to clear a route you commonly travel when exploring a new region, and that lizard may return in the next cycle, or it may take multiple cycles for it to show up again, although it might return stronger than it previously was. This is known as the lineage system. When a creature is killed by the player and their murderous slugcat, if it successfully rolls to respawn, it will roll again to see if it will respawn as a different, usually stronger, variant of its species. This helps to address the simplified question I mentioned prior. Exploration will already have you reach new locations, encounter new creatures, and interact with new mechanics and systems such as creature reputation, procedural animation, and creature reincarnation already will make each cycle distinct. However, this system further compounds that. Easy food sources in one cycle can become deadly predators in the next. Earlier, tutorial-esque regions such as the outskirts can become nightmarish hellscapes filled with some of the most aggressive predators in the game if you decide to continuously butcher its inhabitants. It's a system that incentivizes you to kill sparingly or to explore more, never resting in the same shelter for longer than is necessary. My closing remarks on RainWorld will be spent addressing the first question I asked in this segment, one that I have yet to directly address since. The majority of this part has been spent talking about individual features or systems that I hope will be enough to satisfyingly answer the first part of that question. How is RainWorld unique? However, whilst the second part of that same question may have been indirectly addressed, at least partially, in order to confidently state that it has been answered, I want to directly speak on it. So, how does being unique benefit RainWorld? The obvious answer is that the experience RainWorld provides is exclusive to it. There isn't an equivalent game out there, at least not one currently available, that will provide the experience that RainWorld can give you. The benefit of this is that it opens up the gates for new genres and types of experiences in games. In these terms, RainWorld is categorized as a Metroidvania, a 2D platformer, and a survival game, and yet it doesn't embody any one of these singular genres. Unlike how you could consider Hollow Knight to be the embodiment of a Metroidvania, or the same with Celeste or Super Meat Boy with 2D platformers, or The Forest, Subnautica, or The Long Dark for the survival game genre. These three genres describe key aspects of RainWorld and its gameplay, but I would never be confident in describing the game using any single one of them to a newly interested player. In fact, all three of these miss out on proclaiming the living world and ecosystem, which I consider to be the most defining and appealing aspects of the game. It reminds me of the reason the vague and over-encapsulating Souls-like genre exists, where people wanted classification for the numerous games that were being released that shared wildly varying amounts of mechanics or ideas with the Souls series. And although this isn't something that I want or think would happen with RainWorld as its appeal is far too niche, I would love to see games be created that are inspired by what lies within RainWorld, and that can provide an experience both distinct and reminiscent of it, that I could confidently describe the games to others as being like RainWorld. Even as I defocus from RainWorld, I want to continue the discussion on the benefits found within uniqueness in the media we consume. It should go without saying that the benefits I talked on previously are not unique to RainWorld. Any unique piece of media will provide a unique experience. It can define new genres and will inspire future media to deliver new experiences mindful of it. The final aspect I want to speak on is how these same pieces tend to be more memorable as well. I'm contributing this to a symptom of getting older, but I find now that for something to be memorable, it must be exceptional. And with the continuous consumption of various media, the bar of something even being worth storing in long-term memory rises higher and higher. So when a new AAA FPS releases and it's identical to the previous 3 games in the series, I don't give it a second thought. I've long since found that some of the most memorable experience I've had with games as a whole tends to be those found within the indie genre. Games like Outer Wilds, RainWorld, Undertale, Inscription, and Factorio are prime examples of this. They're games that I still think back on every once in a while, whether it be the interesting mechanics they introduced, the addictive gameplay they had, or the beautifully crafted atmosphere or story they conveyed. These games are like perfectly portioned meals when compared to the bland and bloated buffet that AAA games can often feel like, with so much generic and filler content that you'll inevitably be full long before completion. Yet there's an ungodly amount of time, effort, and almost certainly passion put into these games by the developers that work on them day in and day out, and yet they can be forgotten about by most people within a year. In the words of Jacob Geller, the real measure of a game's longevity isn't how long it takes to beat, but how long it sticks with you after you have beaten it. How long did Ghost Recon Breakpoint stick with you, or Call of Duty Black Ops 4, or Anthem? These are all games that released after RainWorld, and yet RainWorld is the only one that has stuck with me ever since I played it back in 2017. From posts made on various forums, I've seen arguments made against current indie games, stating that they've fallen into the same trap as AAA games, where they're all just copying each other, being either Metroidvanias or roguelikes, and too commonly having underlying undertones about depression or LGBTQ related topics. I want to discuss the argument and break it down piece by piece, quote by quote, giving my view on each point made, but before I do so, I want to ask those who agree with this basic argument, where are you looking? The stack of indie games rises high, and at first glance this argument feels like solely looking at the top of that stack. The games that have achieved critical acclaim for the topics they discuss, the way in which they did so, or for the gameplay they provide. But if these games don't resonate with you, then that's fine. Not every game will, and it shouldn't be expected for them to do so, but to throw out the lot of indie games because of this is simply wasteful. This is something that you can argue I did in the prior part of this video, by making remarks towards AAA games as a collective whole, and you're right, I did. However, this was intentionally done to try to draw out the same emotion in you that I feel when I see these more general statements being made against entire categories of games, but I'll rectify that now. Games like Doom Eternal, the newer God of Wars, and Elden Ring show that AAA games have always had the potential to be incredible, with Doom Eternal having the most fun FPS gameplay that I've experienced in years, the newer God of War games possessing a good mix of fun and engaging gameplay with a satisfying story portrayed through gorgeous visuals, and Elden Ring setting a new standard for how open world games should be done. Ubisoft. These games can be lost if you disregard the entirety of AAA games based on the top games in the category, those that are commonly tailored for mass appeal, such as Call of Duty and FIFA. I hope that you can see that both indie and AAA games can be completely disregarded if you solely look at the top games in their respective categories and don't like what you see. But I've talked on this point for long enough, and now would be a good time to go back and dissect each piece of the argument being made. The first point of this two-piece argument is that indie games have fallen into the same trap as AAA games, where they're all just copying each other, being either Metroidvanias or roguelikes. Firstly, on the topic of games copying each other, I think it's fair for games to take elements from other games and include them in their own. This is especially true when these elements serve to simply improve the quality of life when playing these games. Take the pinging system from Apex Legends for example. So long as the game builds on top of these elements or solely uses them to amplify the user experience, then copying shouldn't be problematic, although issues can arise when too much is copied and not enough is changed. However, the next part of the quote makes the proposed issues seem related to the genre of games rather than individual elements. This is a trend that affects the entirety of gaming, not just solely indie games. In 2017, when PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds showed how successful the Battle Royale concept was for interactive media, many other games quickly followed suit to capitalize on the emerging genre, both AAA and indie. Warzone and Fortnite are examples of AAA Battle Royales that are still existing today with sizable audiences, and Fall Guys would be an example of the same thing but within the indie genre. These are all examples of games that chased after a trending genre, and yet they are very distinct from each other, and this carries over when we look at indie Metroidvanias and roguelikes. The Binding of Isaac, Dead Cells, Slay the Spire, Vampire Survivors, Hades and Darkest Dungeon 2 are all indie roguelikes, although that genre, and thus the idea of doing runs to unlock rewards to help in future runs, is all that they share. Each game vastly differs from the other, both visually and mechanically. The genre doesn't bind these games to a set strict format, and I would be hard pressed to say that these games copied each other in having their game be a roguelike. The same is true for indie Metroidvanias. Hollow Knight, Blasphemous, Ori and the Blind Forest, and, of course, Rainworld are all in this genre, and yet the gameplay, pacing, atmosphere and style differs drastically in each one. All the games mentioned in both genres are unique and as such attract different audiences even if they share genres. It's very possible for someone who loves Metroidvanias to dislike Rainworld for example, or for someone who hates roguelikes to love Slay the Spire. There's more to these games than a single, broadly defining genre. The second part of this two-piece argument is as follows: that indie games too commonly have underlying undertones relating to sensitive personal topics such as depression, or discuss topics that relate to the LGBTQ community. My first counterpoint is that I don't think this is as common as it is made out to be. From the top of my head, I can think of Amori, Celeste, That Dragon, Cancer, and Night in the Woods for games which fall under this umbrella. There are certainly many more, however these 4 games garnered large audiences for various reasons, not solely because of the undertones or topics they conveyed, and I wonder if it's another case of that issue that I mentioned prior, where people view the games at the top of the stack and view the rest of the pile as being duplicates of what lies above. The second counterpoint is that I don't see how this is a problem. An emotional story can have so much more weight behind it and can be so much more memorable if the topics it discusses are relatable to the player. And even if it doesn't relate to the player, seeing the topic or struggle portrayed through interactive media can give so much insight into the subject at hand. For the people these stories relate to, however, it can mean the world to them to experience a piece of media that tells them that they're not alone in their struggle, and that at the very least, someone out there gets it. Even still, it's understandable to not want to experience an emotional story. Maybe you're emotional enough as is. Well, there's still plenty of indie games out there that don't focus on trying to relate to real world struggles. They might focus purely on gameplay, or even still can provide amazing stories. Speaking of which, when we look at games such as Before Your Eyes, What Remains of Edith Finch, or Return of the Obra Dinn, we see games that when simplified are all about telling a story. The stories they tell are of course different, however what they don't differ in is in how they strive to tell these stories in captivating and creative ways. I won't spoil how each does so, but their methods have clearly resonated with a sizable audience. I'd recommend you try these games for yourself. They're very reasonably priced, and I think it's worth seeing if the experience they provide melds with you. If stories or mysteries or stories of mysteries don't appeal to your tastes, then there are plenty of unique games that have a gameplay first attitude. I've mentioned 2 in passing already. Hollow Knight and Factorio are absolute gems. They have long since escaped the niche confines that restrains many indie titles and have attracted broad audiences. This alone should be enough to convey to you that they are well worth your time, and at least a look at the minimum. If these games seem too slow, then we need only to look at Ultrakill and RoboQuest, both of which are fast-paced shooters reminiscent of the pace found within Quake Live, and similar to it in their ability to put the player into a trance-like state, trying to effectively utilise all the available tools provided to clear rooms whilst also trying to minimise damage taken. The point of bringing up all of these games is to show the variety that exists within the imaginary pile of indie games. There will always be bad apples within every bunch. However, as I said at the start of this video, I don't think you should disregard the whole because of that. With the amount of passion put into these games, and with the amount of thought and effort put into creating worlds, various mechanics and stories, of how unique and personal these experiences can be, I think that you'll almost certainly find a game that appeals specifically to you. Maybe it'll stick with you long after you complete it, similar to how Rainworld has stuck with me. Maybe you'll appreciate the world or story it presents, or the gameplay it provides, and maybe you'll view it as refreshing, simply for the unique experience it held. So yeah, that is the end of the video. Hi, it's an unscripted Chris Foster here. But yeah, that's it. All video content pertaining to the topic of this video, the title of it, Indie Uniqueness featuring Rainworld, that's it, it's done. Thank you so much for watching. But you're probably wondering why the video is still going, maybe why there's some more runtime left. It's because I want to raise awareness for something. So it'll require me to briefly talk a bit on the production of this video, but I don't want to blindside anyone in this section. If you're not in a good mental spot right now, if you're feeling down, if you've had a bad day, then maybe consider not watching this next section, okay? It's not a very happy section, but we'll begin. So to start with, this is the first video that I've ever edited using editing software. It's the first video I've ever wrote a script for. And then from there, it's the first video I've ever had to, open Audacity, do some audio mixing to make sure the audio was at least audible. And if you're like me, you might be able to relate in the sense when you get new software or even new hardware and you want to utilize a feature you maybe don't know how, or there's an issue that's occurred, you'll maybe try for a bit, figure it out, to maybe solve it, and then you'll realize, no, I don't want to sit here anymore, and you just look it up on YouTube, like you put the exact problem in on YouTube, and like 50 different channels will appear that you've never heard of, will have really in-depth videos going into how to solve that issue or how to use that feature that you didn't know how to use. And because this is the first time I've ever edited a video using Vegas Pro, I had to do this a fair amount of times. And a channel I kept seeing show up again and again was a channel called Tech Tips and Tech Stuff, hosted by an individual named Ron Prieston. And it was maybe around the 4th or 5th time that I had seen this channel and I'd watched some of his videos for help that I got a bit curious, because these videos are 6 or 7 years old. And so you kind of wonder, is this person still making these videos? Are they doing something else? Have they moved on? What's going on? And so I clicked into the channel, looked at his newest videos. This is what I saw. I'm Dying and I'm Afraid, a video with 279 views, uploaded on the 4th of December 2023. So you can probably guess by the fact that I'm including this as a section in a video that it just doesn't relate to it all, but this had a decent impact on me. It's something that has been in the back of my mind for a couple months now. Ron Prieston suffers from a condition known as diffuse scleroderma. Requires a special diet, medication, and oxygen, which keeps him alive, and only a fraction of that is covered by his insurance. Yeah, seeing how much this individual's videos have helped me get started in video editing, seeing how much it made it so that I was able to continue production, that I didn't give up at any point. It just feels so sad to me seeing such a video with such a low view count. If you want to know any details on the subject, on that video there's a GoFundMe, there's one linked in the description as well, for Ron Prieston, that has all the details relating to the pricing of his medication and all his requirements and why he even needs a GoFundMe to begin with because of this. And yeah, seeing how much this individual has not only supported me, but I'm sure countless others, seeing the view counts of some of his more viewed videos, it just feels right to try to raise a bit of awareness to someone who supported us so much, to try to give back some of that support in some way. And so I can only ask, if you have any disposable income that you're absolutely certain you will not need, all I can ask is for you to consider donating a portion of that to help Ron. But yeah, that's the actual end of the video. Again, thank you so much for watching. Hope you've had an amazing day and continue to have an amazing day and night and sleep. Take care. Goodbye.